Hi, my name is Juliet, and I'm the creator and host of Connecting the Dots podcast. I love ideas and problem solving, and my career in communication has led me down a path of curiosity. Why we do what we do, how we tell better stories, and how African scientists solve everyday problems. Join me on this enlightening and entertaining exploration of African science like you've never experienced before. Get ready to laugh, learn, and be inspired. Welcome everyone to the 2025 edition of the Connecting the Dots podcast, where we have the opportunity to spotlight African science leaders. Today we are here with Professor Abdoulaye Djimde, joining us all the way from Mali. Professor Djimde is the Professor of Parasitology and Mycology and Chief of the Molecular Epidemiology and Drug Resistant Unit at the Malaria Research and Training Center at the University of Bamako in Mali. He is also a Callistus Juma Science Leadership Fellow and the President of the Pathogens Genomic Diversity Network of Africa. Differences in the genetic makeup of the malaria parasites, humans, and mosquitoes influence things such as the spread of anti-malarial drug resistance. We're very, very delighted to have you on the podcast today. Welcome, Professor Djimde.
Thank you, Juliet.
Djimde, we have a segment on this podcast where we begin by really understanding, your background, where you grew up, and what inspired you to become the African science leader that you are. So maybe you could give us a little snapshot about your upbringing from the small village in Mali where you grew up and how this really shaped your journey into science.
Thank you, Juliet. I grew up in a small village in the eastern part of Mali named Koro. It was more like a small town at the size of Mali, but still like any rural African site, like 12 hours drive from the capital city. There was no electricity, no running water, just a typical African village where I was going to school. I was curious by nature, and I remember my sort of exposure to research came through reading spare newspapers that tourists passing by would live in the small guest house that tourists used to stay to. And there was a journal that I enjoyed a lot called Research. It was a French journal where they would write articles on astrology, on all kind of weird things. I didn't understand much, but I was really visiting that guest house very regularly, hoping that I would run into another copy of that journal left over by tourists passing by. I think that's really was part of my research exposure. And the next when I was a bit older, my late boss, Professor Abdoulaye Djimde, who was a medical student then, used to, during his vacations, come to our school and give lectures on parasitic diseases. And that was really high light of the year. We would just be scotched to his mouth, trying to understand as much as we can from his explanations of how parasites evolve, how they infect people, how they make people sick, etc. So I think these are the two main facts that I can remember in my childhood that drew me into wanting to be a researcher.
And Djimde, can you tell us, were your parents supportive of you going into an academic or research career at that time?
Well, my dad is a teacher. He was an English teacher. So he was very supportive. He was actually rewarding. I remember I used to be the first of my class. So whenever I was 3 times in a row, first of the class, he will give me a brand new outfit. So that was a very good incentive for me to keep performing in school. So he did everything to encourage me to go as far as possible.
Your profile, Professor Djimde, says that you went on to study pharmacy, and then from pharmacy is when you transitioned into looking at malaria, which is a big problem on the entire continent. Can you just enlighten us on what caused that transition from pharmacy and you working as a pharmacist into now transitioning into the labs and then developing a group of early career researchers who could then take on the malaria research work that you had commenced? What encouraged or informed you to move from pharmacy to malaria research?
Well, actually, becoming a pharmacist was a bit of an accident. I really wanted to be a medical doctor who look after patients, mainly because, as you said, malaria was then the number one disease and the number one killer in Mali, which still is the number one disease and the number one killer in Mali. And so everybody growing up that time is a survivor of malaria, and everybody has siblings and family members, friends who suffered from malaria. And I personally lost one of my brothers to the disease when I was 11 or 12 years. And that's when I decided to become a doctor. Back then, I wanted to be a medical doctor so that I can look after sick children. But it plays out that I couldn't actually go to medical school because of the way the schooling system was organized in Mali. If you had good grades in math and physics, they would send you to pharmacy. And if you had good grades in biology, they sent you to medicine. That's the only reason why I ended up in pharmacy. But I don't regret. I really enjoy the pharmacy studies. But being a pharmacist, I realized that even if I can't actually treat a patient like medical doctors do, I can still contribute to a fight against malaria. And that's how I found my way to the research center and embarked on the career in malaria research.
And Djimde, for most of our listeners, malaria is one of the most serious health challenges in Africa. And over the years, we've made remarkable progress in controlling it. Around the world, the malaria parasite has repeatedly developed ways to survive treatments that once worked very well. This pattern of resistance first emerged in Southeast Asia and then has spread significantly to other regions, including in Africa. Are you able to share the story of how you discovered the molecular marker for this resistance and why it was such a game changer?
Well, when I joined the Malaria Research and Training Center initially as a volunteer and later on embarked on a PhD study in the University of Maryland in Baltimore, my focus obviously was malaria. And being a pharmacist, I wanted to be as close as possible to drugs because pharmacists are specialists of drugs.
Right.
So that's how I found myself working on understanding the efficacy of antimalarial drugs that are used in the country. Back then, the main drug was chloroquine, and chloroquine was the wonder drug that everybody would use whenever they have any fever. Those days, diagnosis was not mandatory like it is today. So I started by running field studies to understand what is the response of the parasite to the drug. Basically, if you treat 100 patients that have malaria with chloroquine, how many would cure their disease and how fast they will do that and how long this cure is going to be sustained. That's what we call in vivo studies. That's what I had been doing in the field here in Mali. And we started a collaboration with the National Institute of Health in the United States. My mentors, Dr. Thomas, came to the center in Mali because they had found a new molecular tool to look into molecular mechanisms of drug resistance. Initially, it was not chloroquine resistance. We started working on pyrimethamine resistance because the gene responsible for chloroquine resistance was not known then. And a few years later, Tom Williams' group discovered a gene that was associated with resistance to chloroquine in the laboratory. Now, it was left to know, is that gene also involved with parasite resistance to chloroquine in the field? So that was the topic of my PhD thesis. We conducted studies in people, and we conducted laboratory studies running what is now known as PCR, which is a way of amplifying the genetic material of the parasite and looking at changes that occur in the genetic material of the parasite and making the link between people's response to chloroquine treatment and the presence or the absence of these genetic changes in the parasite's DNA. So that's how we established the correlation between the gene, which is named PFCRT, and chloroquine resistance, and went on to develop the first molecular marker of chloroquine resistance that is still used around the world to get chloroquine resistance in Plasmodium falciparum.
Professor Djimde, what's another way of referring to the molecular marker for chloroquine resistance for your grandmother in the village who's trying to understand what are we trying to say when we said you are the first person to identify this. How can we put that simply in layman's language?
Well, it's a feature in the parasite that if that feature is present, you can say that the parasite is not going to be killed by the drug. So it's a feature that is in the gene, in the genetic material, in other words, the DNA of a parasite that we look using tools in the laboratory. And if you find that feature, you can say that the parasite is not going to be killed by the drug.
That's a really good way to put it, Prof. Djimde. And chloroquine, once the go-to treatment for malaria, was affordable and easy to use, but over time the parasite became resistant to it, making this drug less effective. Today, the plant-based artemisinin is the backbone of the best malaria treatments. However, we are beginning to also see resistance to artemisinin, which is now beginning to become a growing concern. How do malaria parasites become resistant to drugs? And will there come a time where we see malaria fully eradicated from the world, given that it's an age-old disease?
Yeah, the thing is that we are people and the parasites, they want to live as much as we want to live. Unfortunately, by living, they make us sick and sometimes they kill us. And we don't want to be sick and we don't want to die from the parasite. So we use drugs to kill the parasites. And the parasites don't want to die also. So they try to find ways of not being killed by the drugs that we use.
Right.
So when we discover a new drug, the parasite doesn't know how to deal with it and it kills a lot of parasites. Over time, the parasite becomes sort of clever and find ways of not being killed, or at least not being killed as fast or as much by the new drug that we use. So that's exactly what we call drug resistance. And that's what happened with chloroquine and it happened with sulfadoxine pyrimethamine. And we are starting to see the signs of that developing in artemisinin, the latest new drugs. I think it's a matter of time and it's a matter of usage of the drug. So if you use the drug long enough, the parasite eventually is going to find a way to prevent it from killing the parasites. What we need to do as scientists, and that's what has been happening, is to be one step ahead of the parasite. So while we have a drug that works, we do research to discover new drugs that we can use when the resistance develops to the old drugs. So we think that by having more new drugs in the market, in pharmacies, and new drugs that act differently in their way of killing the parasites, we can be a few steps ahead of the parasite and eventually be able to one day eradicate malaria. Elimination is possible. There are a growing number of countries that have been able to eliminate malaria, including in Africa. So I hope, despite the cleverness of the parasites.
Djimde, on the point of elimination, I know that only last year in December, the WHO released the World Malaria Report, and it seemed that the news was not quite as positive as we would have hoped, especially given this comes on the back of COVID, the pandemic, and the number of cases have risen significantly. Do you feel that elimination is far? I know Egypt recently had said it has eliminated malaria. Yeah.
Yes, in recent years, 3 countries in Africa were certified free of malaria: Cabo Verde, Algeria, and the most recent country is Egypt. The problem is in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite steady progress between 2000 and 2015, after 2015, we witnessed a stalling of increase of the cases of malaria. And with the COVID pandemic, we actually saw a resurgence of cases. So in the last few years, we starting to see signs of parasites being less sensitive to artemisinin, which is worrisome. So in sub-Saharan Africa, that's where we now have almost 95% of the global cases of malaria. So if you take 100 patients that have malaria in the world, 95 of them will be residents of sub-Saharan Africa. We need intensify. We have the tools. The tools that we have, if they are appropriately deployed, we can make a major progress and even eliminate malaria even in sub-Saharan Africa. But there are a number of difficulties, including the state of the health systems that we have in most of the sub-Saharan African countries, and the environment that is very conducive to the maintenance of disease, enforcement of the proper use of drugs, and the availability of drugs where they are the most needed. Actually, stronger political will to get rid of malaria by our respective governments. All of these are issues contributing to the fact that this disease is still taking an unacceptable toll in sub-Saharan Africa.
Djimde, on to the challenges that you have faced or the ones that you've also outlined in terms of proper use of drugs, the health systems. We recently interviewed one of your colleagues, Professor Okeke, who's focused on bacteria. And one of the things that she also touched a little bit on was, in addition to AMR, just using drugs properly. I wonder if you want to talk to climate change and if that also has an impact on the resurgence of cases in addition to the COVID-19.
Yes. Climate change has clearly demonstrated its impact on resurgence of malaria. It's even very easy to see what climate change is doing with the recent flooding that happened in different places of Africa. And as you know, when you have water, you have mosquito breeding sites. And when you have mosquito breeding sites, you have increased cases of malaria. So, for example, in Mali and in most of the Sahel areas, this last malaria transmission season, we had flooding in the desert. These are places where usually 1 or 2 rains per year. And this year, there were flooding in the desert, which resulted in increasing cases of malaria. And if you look at the flooding that happened in areas like Mozambique, it brought up the cases of malaria. Not only climate change contributes to the increase in malaria by the environmental conditions that it creates for the mosquitoes to thrive, but also by disrupting the already weak health system. When there is flooding, it's more difficult to reach health centers. All of prevention is disorganized. Distribution of bed nets is more difficult. So all of this sort of bring us back in terms of the efforts that we do to tackle malaria. So this climate change is a major impediment to the elimination of malaria as well.
Can I bring you back to your role as the president of the pDNA network and just on genomic sequencing? Scientists have been using genomic sequencing to really understand the malaria parasite. What does that mean in simple terms, and how does it help us tackle the drug resistance or respond to outbreaks, and especially not only in Mali, but also across the continent?
We, as African scientists, realize that we'll not advance as fast as we can by working in silo. That's why we came together and created this network, Pathogen Genomic Diversity Network Africa, which includes 17 countries now and more than 20 institutions across sub-Saharan Africa, where we work together, get our minds together, run studies together, and share our samples, share our data, and analyze them collectively to have a better picture of the genetics of the parasite. Why genetics? I was explaining at the beginning that resistance happens when the parasite changes some of its features. And the feature that actually it changes is in its blueprint. It's the nature drawing that commands all of the behavior of the parasite, including how the parasite responds to drug treatment. And because of the difficulty in dealing with malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, we came to realize that we need to think outside the box and we need to come up with more creative solutions to the issue at hand. That's why we decided to invest in understanding the blueprint of the parasites and how this blueprint evolves over time and how this blueprint is different from different parts of the continent. That's what the pDNA network does. and we look at the DNA of the parasite and we compare it with other parasites from other places of the continent, and we compare it to other parasites outside the continent, and we compare the DNA of the parasite that make people sick versus those that don't make people sick, etc. And this is going to give us information, novel information that will help in improving our success in eliminating malaria from our continent.
Djimde, on your work as the president of the PDNA network, what are the things that excite you very quickly?
Well, the things that are exciting is the opportunity to bring together scientists and samples and data from as far as Cabo Verde to the western tip of Africa to Madagascar on the southeastern tip of Africa. And that by being able to readily put all of this information together, we are able to make discoveries that none of us can do by working in his or her individual country.
And Djimde, when it comes to myths and misconceptions, what are some of the myths that you've had around malaria or other parasites you hear that really frustrate you? Top three?
Well, I don't think it's not an irritation, but one of the hallmark of malaria is fever. And there's a lot of other diseases that cause fever. So being able to disentangle what fever is due to malaria and treat that appropriately versus fever that is due to other diseases is a major problem. And in many of sub-Saharan African countries, doctors or nurses or healthcare workers sometimes have a shortcut to considering every fever as a case of malaria. And that not only doesn't help with the management of those other causes of fever, but it increases the resistance of malaria parasite to the drugs that we use.
And Djimde, we've seen some work or even some contributions from the current head of state in Mali who's contributed to some science. Would you want to speak a little bit on that?
Yes, we were very pleased that the president of the transition here in Mali has instituted a prize to reward the best scientists of the country. And last year, the winner of the first science prize was one of my colleagues from the MRTC here, Professor Alassane Diko. These are really examples that would encourage young people to get into science. The second example is his government dedication to creating a center of robotics and artificial intelligence here in Mali. And that shows really vision in terms of investing in the knowledge of the future and investing in the careers of the future. These are really two encouraging instances in terms of supporting science from our government here in Mali.
And Djimde, in terms of what the future holds, what are the things that fascinate you or scare you about our world and its future?
Well, in my personal field of genomics, it is really exciting to see that Africa is now starting to sit in the driving seat. We used to be dependent on our northern colleagues for sequencing or for the bioinformatics that is necessary for analyzing the data, for infrastructure that is necessary for hosting the data. And increasingly, capacity is being developed here on the continent where we can do sequencing in-house, we can house the data on servers on the continent, and we are increasingly training young scientists in bioinformatics and in big data science to be able to analyze all this genetic data here on the ground, and seeing how this field is evolving, how young scientists are progressing in it. It sort of is heartening to be hopeful that we are up for a better future in terms of fighting against diseases in Africa and malaria specifically.
What scares you?
Well, what scares me is, again, the over reliance on external funding on the research that we do. We really need to rally the African governments to make investment in research as a priority so that we can use local money to fund our research, because it's only through local funding that we can be deciding what are the priorities that our countries need and focus our attention to those priorities. Over-reliance on external funding is really worrisome.
Djimde, if you could live in any time period, past or future, strictly for the science, which would you choose and why?
Well, I will live in the future.
Why?
mainly because it's just fascinating to see how science is evolving, how the technology is evolving, and how the capabilities of discovering solutions is evolving. I just mentioned artificial intelligence. I think Africa needs to really grab this opportunity. There are fears, but we can't stop progress. We need to grab this opportunity and learn to make the most out of all of the technologies that are available and the technologies that are upcoming. Seeing what you can do, how fast you can actually streamline drug discovery using artificial intelligence makes me wanting to be 25 years younger.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Professor Abdoulaye Djimde, for your insights, for sharing these with us. We look forward to seeing more of your work, especially through your leadership with the pDNA network. Wishing you all the very best, and as you champion and involve policymakers, especially in their funding support to research on the continent. Thank you so much, Djimde.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots podcast, created by me, Juliet. This episode was brought to life by Mumbua and Kevin at Silent Global in Nairobi, Kenya. If you enjoyed this episode, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Tag us on CTD Pod Africa on all platforms. Keep the conversation going. Let us know what you'd love to hear about, and join me on the next episode as I interview the next amazing scientist here on Connecting the Dots podcast.